actor, a writer, and a director who has lived all over the world, from Montreal, Canada, to Melbourne, Australia, and across the Iron Curtain in East Germany. And for our purposes, he's both Captain Magenta and Captain Indigo in Captain Scarlet and Mistrons, the Hood in Thunderbirds 6, and Matthew Harding in the Secret Service. So please give a big TV21 welcome to Mr. Gary Files.
Very pleased to be here. I've never done one of these before, so in absolute terror I have written down a bit of an idea about what we used to do, hopefully that will give you a sort of a warm-up to some questions that we're going to have in a short while. So I'll just start with the reason why I was very happy to come here to Bristol. I was working down here at Bristol at the Old Vic Company in the 1960s with a lot of respectable actors who went on to become big names on British TV, like Richard Pascoe, Barbara Lee Hunt, Frank Middlemas, Jane Asher, Jane LaPortaire, Gordon Granger, Janet Key, and Anna Carteret, to drop a few names. When word came down from London that Gerry Anderson and the Thunderbird people were looking for American accents. As the pay was terrific, and as it was known that my American accent was tops, a whole lot of the actors from the Bristol Old Vic Company advised me to make contact with Century 21 Productions, Gerry's company, post-haste. My accent was so good because it had to be. I trained at the National Theatre School of Canada, the only Australian to have ever done so, I may say, and started in the profession there. So for me to get TV work and work there generally, my Canadian accent had to be perfect. In other words, it soon became obvious that being able to do other North American accents would aid my work possibilities even more. So when I approached Century 21, I cheated a bit and put together a tape introducing myself and talking like a Canadian. I also did a whole lot of American accents and a few other exotics like West Indian, African, Scots, and as an afterthought, Australian, and sent it to Gerry Anderson in London. He later told me I got the job, first on the movie Thunderbirds 6, then on their new series Captain Scarlet and the Mistrons, mainly because he was amazed to hear a Canadian of all people doing such a terrific Australian accent. I really had no idea who or what the Century 21 people and their puppet series were about. It was only after I was one of the team that I realised just what a big success they were, both in England and later in the United States. Gerry had invented supermarionation, which I'm sure you all know about, and even more important, he was the first to have a video monitor that worked off the camera's lens, so he could see what a take was like straight away, on replay. That meant he only printed the takes which he felt worked, thus saving on processing, film stock, blah, blah, blah. The sound and model people were also doing amazing things with their puppets out there in the tiny studios they had in the London suburb of Slough. Many of the special effects people that Gerry trained and encouraged were snatched away by the Americans, first by Stanley Kubrick for 2001, and then later on, the people who did Star Wars. First in England, then in LA. A lot of voice people got good work because of Gerry. He was wonderfully loyal to us regulars. Of course, we had to be very flexible too, although there was a stable of roughly 8 to 10 people on a regular basis. They had to play all sorts of extra characters as well. We worked out one day that we'd done 56 different characters between us in the 3 supermarionation series, Captain Scarlet and the Mistrons, Joe 90 and the Secret Service. Some memories from that time were working in a studio very near Covent Garden Market, which was at that time still working as a bulk vegetable market for London. Most of the trolleys of that market used solid metal wheels, which used to rumble on the pavement. So more often than not, we'd find ourselves pausing to let the trolley pass, and then going on with the drama. It was there too that we tried out Gerry's famous quiet paper. It was a normal script printed onto what seemed like blotting paper. as with a radio drama script, we used to read a page we were on and then slid it under the script. It was that noise that they were trying to get rid of. But the blotting paper was hell. It didn't want to move or slide at all. So the racket of us trying to turn the bloody page was worse than what they were trying to get rid of. So Jerry decided to forget it. We worked in many studios, but the two most impressive were the one in Portland Place near the BBC and the big hangar-like film studio out at Denham. The latter was my favourite. It was where we shot Thunderbirds 6, which, as I said, was my first job with Century 21. After a lot of fun on the movie and 2 TV series, I finally had my big chance and was chosen to be co-lead with Stanley Unwin in the next series. He was a marvellous comedy actor. I'm sure a lot of you would know about him, best known for his funny language that he'd invented. He used this language to confuse the villains whenever we got into trouble. He was the village curate and an amateur sleuth, and I'm sure a lot of you have seen it, and I was his gardener. But as this was a Jerry Anderson sci-fi series, he was a gardener with a difference. My character Matthew shrank down to a tiny size and was thus able to foil the villain of the day. I'd always imagined that Jerry's series were essentially aimed at the younger end of the market, but they've appealed to people right across the age spectrum in a surprising way. When we finally branched into live-action sci-fi, I was fortunate enough to be asked to be in the pilot episode of UFO, just before I headed off from England to Canada and eventually home to Australia. And now here we are at the Century 21 convention. God, I mean, that sounds amazing to me. Just about as amazing as the longevity of Jerry Anderson's pioneering work with his Century 21 productions. Although a company with a name like that should cause no surprise when their product is still going strong right now in this era of their namesake, 40-odd years later. So finally, I hope that you get as much enjoyment out of this convention as I did working with Jerry and the terrific team involved with the Super Mario Nation series. A wonderful, talented team which contained the likes of Dave Lane, Stanley Unwin, Keith Alexander, David Healy, Shane Rimmer, and Jeremy Wilkin, and Bud Tingwall, a great mate of mine, to name a few. As for me, I'll be roughing it on those beautiful beaches in an Australian summer when I get back, trying to make ends meet. And by the by, to keep those who employ me happy, would you please watch out for Dog Star 2? It's on the BBC, and it's the second in a series in which I play a mad scientist and inventor called Raymond Ridley. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We'll have that for Fab. Let's get the painter, guys. So Gary, what was the process behind you moving from Canada to London? Because a lot of performers seem to travel across there in the kind of late 50s, early 60s.
Yeah.
Where things were happening.
Well, I had done a bit of work in the Canadian theatre scene. I went to the National Theatre School of Canada, which was in Montreal and was the first bilingual school, I believe, theatre school, in the world. I might be wrong, but I thought that's what it was. And if I got nothing else out of it, I got the French-Canadian accent, eh? You know, those guys talk like that, they don't speak like a French person. And the French that they speak is called joual, which is their way of saying cheval or horse. Very strange, but the French detest it. It's kind of like, no, I won't go there. It's like many accents that we don't like in English, you know, and when you try and speak to a Frenchman in French-Canadian, oh no, not good. But I started in the profession in Canada and I did some work there, luckily, thank God. Very good work, but I felt I wanted to stretch. And as I could do a lot of British accents, I thought I'll have a go, you know, see how it goes. If it's a dud, doesn't matter, I'll go back.
Now you worked which is very interesting for us, with Joan Littlewood's famous theatre workshop.
Ah, right.
Quite a few big names in the Anderson scene started out there. Ed Bishop and George Sewell.
Right.
Both worked on the theatre workshop.
Yeah, well, George especially. Yeah, yeah.
And I wondered, if you could tell us maybe a bit about that, and was that particularly useful in
Oh, it was tremendous. I had done Oh What a Lovely War in Toronto prior to coming, and the guy who directed that was a guy called Kevin Palmer, who had been stage manager for Joan's original production of Oh What a Lovely War, which meant that Kevin used to give you notes that Joan had given his actors, her actors, you know. I used to think, my God, this is fantastic notes, and I realised afterwards, oh, Kevin, you obviously wrote it down and now you're giving it back to us. It was a tremendous help, because when I came to England, I had an introduction from Kevin Palmer to go and see Joan Littlewood and Jerry Raffles at Stratford East, which, as you know, is down the East End and all. And so I went down there to see them, and anyway, they said to me, can you do various things? So I did a few British accents for them, and they said, oh, that's good. Can you do Kevin Palmer? Well, Kevin Palmer's Australian. No worries, I did Kevin Palmer. So they laughed like drains, and they said, you're in, and you're playing the Murray Melvin parts that were in the original production. So that was how I started, in a tour of East Germany, West Germany and Belgium, which was at that time pretty eye-opening, because the wall was still up, and it was pretty amazing. Yeah, I had to go through Checkpoint Charlie every day in a bus when we were playing West Berlin. We lived in the East because it was cheaper, say.
Presumably you were performing in English.
Yes, well, we did it totally in English, but everyone understood to a great extent. There were several things that obviously had to be different. The band used to play in England, bum 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 bum, like that. In Germany it was bum 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 bum. The music director went mad. He said, no, schnell, schnell, schnell. All these Deutsches. Oh. Anyway, they were great. And the audience got a hell of a lot. And the DDR had a special program that came with it in East Germany that explained politically correctly what we were doing. But the audience, they all knew. Yeah.
Did you find that the working methods of working with Joan Littlewood were useful for, especially for the Anderson work?
No, Joan is totally unique. Joan would... 50% of what Joan said was bullshit. You just had to know what was the 50%. If she demanded something from you, if you were cheating, by cheating she meant you weren't really filling a part. I mean, I could do all that sort of stuff, you know, like the geezers, you know, here we are, we come back from the war and we were all shot to buggery and all this sort of stuff. And she would say to me, Gary Files, you have no idea what you're talking about, you bloody Australian. And my response to that was, hey Joan, have you ever been to Melbourne or Sydney? Have you seen bloody slums there? A slum is a slum, mate, whether you're here in bloody Britain or over there. So she shut up and left me alone. But she liked to try to, you know, did make you think as an actor, which was terrific.
So you've explained the process by which you joined 2021. Was right. Do you remember Thunderbirds 6 would be your first?
It was the first, and it was a feature film, and it had Jeffrey Keane in it, as I remember. And I was stunned because, first of all, we did it in this huge hangar, which was the corner of the hangar, which was the Debenham Studios, where Alexander Korda, I think, had done tremendous stuff there. And then we went to a nearby village after we'd finished recording the voices, which took about, oh, a good morning, possibly a little bit more than the morning, and Jerry had set up a wonderful dinner at a very nice pub, where everyone proceeded to fall off their face. Great, really great.
Did you have, when you were taking over from Ray Barrett as the Hood, did you have, did he give you like a guide track to work from what the voice had been before?
I honestly can't remember that. But obviously, because my placement is Australian, Australians have what they call natural blade. If the microphone wasn't here, I could still get to you like that using an Australian accent because it cuts right through everything. You only have to go to a football match in Australia to realise that. So Ray has the same thing. Although we can become terribly British and very clearly speak, at the same time we have the basis of the thing is up here where the nose is.
Yeah.
So it cuts through. And that would be the similarity for Jerry, I suppose, and for the recording team. They go, oh, their voices are a bit similar, let's use that. Yeah.
It's interesting because there's this fabled thing called the cultural cringe, which is supposed to exist, where Australians think that Britons have class, whereas Britons kind of think the opposite. They think they like Australians because they don't have class.
Yes, that used to be very helpful when I was with the Bristol Old Vic Company. I'll give you a very quick story. We were in the middle of a rehearsal of Tale of Two Cities, and the door burst open at the back, and a member of the company was a guy called Jeremy Child. Do any of you know who Jeremy Child is? Oh, well, he's a very well-known British television actor, well-known. He's a British television actor who, his family are aristocracy, really. He's Sir Jeremy Child, really. And he went to Eton, and he had a lot of Eton friends who had come down to see Jeremy at Bristol. You know, oh, let's go down and see Jeremy, cheer him up. You know. Anyway, we're in the middle of rehearsal, and the door burst open at the back of the theatre, and a chappie came in. I say, I'm looking for Jeremy Child. You happen to know where it is? So I immediately, of course, being an Australian outrageous, said, no, I don't actually, but if you go around the side and go up those stairs there, you'll find a door, just push on that and go out there. He'll be out there. And that was the fire escape. Once you're out, you're out.
So you've mentioned in your opening speech that you guys got through a lot of voices. I mean, in some episodes, for instance, of Joe Knight, you got at least 6 voices in a single episode.
Yes.
What was the process by which voices were divided up amongst the cast?
Well, if the voice had a sort of fat feel to it, it's a terrible thing to say, but there were some people like David Healy, who was, shall we say, somewhat well proportioned. David would get that part, particularly if it was an American hood, you know, hey, what the hell's going on here, you know, here we are, these guys are doing something, you know, that shit. So, if it was semi-exotic, I mean, in that we wanted to make it very different from the other voices, I would perhaps do a Scottish accent for that. Now, as most of my relatives, as I realised when I came here, were Scots, it wasn't too hard for me to do that, you know. That's what we used to do.
Right, so, and would the actors kind of sort this out amongst themselves, or would the...
Not hugely as I remember. I think Jerry assigned things, but as you began to realise what various actors could do, you found yourself getting exotic things, like if you are supposed to be an African senator of some sort, you know, from Zimbabwe or somewhere like that. So you would have to do that. I would try and get hold of, because I tended to drift into West Indian. What's happening, man? You know. I used to go and try and get some reference if I could.
What kind of people would you sort of have contact with apart from the actors? I mean, you mentioned Jerry would be supervising the recording sessions. Who else do you remember?
There were several directors. There was an older director who did most of the Captain Scarlet series, and I venture to think that he might not be with us anymore. I cannot remember his name. Something Hill, I think it was at Reg Hill.
Oh, yeah.
Reg Hill. Is he still alive?
No, I'm afraid not.
Okay. Reg would work with us through most of the episodes. Dave Lane, I remember obviously from doing the Secret Service, because Dave directed that. I honestly can't remember some of the other people. But Jerry would have assigned them. He would have said, so-and-so will do this episode. And some people actually have written the episode.
Yeah.
So that helped, yeah.
So when you were working away in, I think Anvil was the name of the studio at Denham.
Yes.
But did you ever get to visit the puppet sets and all the special sets?
Yes. We, a couple of times, especially for the beginning of Captain Scarlet and the Mysterons, they wanted to show us the fantastic effects that they were doing out at Slough. So we went and we saw this incredible miniature setup that they had at Slough. Everything, the sort of stuff that you see later on in 2001 and then the Star Wars. No wonder, because they pinched the people that Jerry trained, you know. So here they were with this set of a city, and the big tower in the city was going to be blown up by the Mysterons. So they said, here's a whole scene set up, and we want you to watch very closely, group. You know, here we are, we've set this all up. It's all about to explode. And we all watched, all these actors, you know, watched. Paf! That was it. So we all looked at each other like, whoa, don't know how that'll be. But what we didn't realise, that they were shooting it with very, very high-speed cameras, and that they were shooting it with several cameras placed in various positions. And when we came to the opening, and that was done at the Columbia Theatre on Shaftesbury Avenue, where they took us there in Rolls Royces and did the whole red carpet number into the theatre, and we sat in special seats at the back, and it was all in Cinerama, not Cinerama, but quite large on the big screen. And that sequence came on. Well, my God, they put fantastic sound to it. It was shot in this very high speed, so it was like the end of the world, you know, crash, buildings fell, you saw pieces falling slowly and impressively, you know. We thought, my God, these guys really know what they're doing. Yeah.
Did you get a feeling working on the series how each series was doing? Thunderbirds was like a national or an international hit, and was like a national obsession even in Australia.
Yes, it was, yeah.
Captain Scarlet slightly less so, and then...
Well, we had, luckily, most of us had no experience of the first, doing the Thunderbird series, because the Thunderbird puppets, as you know, the heads were quite big in relation to the body. Ours was the first series where they wanted to put the heads in proper proportion to the body. It didn't mean anything to us, so we were quite cool, but the other people who were sort of on the other series felt a bit, I don't know, miffed or something. No, not miffed, but, oh, this is a bit different, you know, the heads are the right size, how's that going to be? Plus the super marionation that Jerry invented, whereby a wire went down to the puppet's head. Your voice, which you had recorded weeks previously, would go through the gate of the camera as the camera was starting to shoot the scene. And the puppet's mouth went into sync with your voice. Which was very impressive, my God. And that was the reason why we could never overlap each other when we were doing the scene. You know, most of us came from radio. In radio, you can sometimes overlap someone because it's on a mono system or even stereo, it doesn't matter. If I'm saying to you, I think you're an absolute swine, sir. Just a moment, hold on a second. You can overlap sometimes. With Jerry, you couldn't overlap. No, you've overlapped. Go back, do that again. So you had to keep the same passion going but have that little gap. Now we know why, because that puppet and that puppet over there cannot both speak at the same time. So your voice would go through for your puppet, and then the other person's voice would go for the other puppet, and the heads would move separately, if you see what I mean.
As a viewer, Joe 90 seems a more relaxed series than Captain Scarlet.
That was Rupert Davies.
Yeah.
Does anyone remember Rupert Davies from Inspector Maygrey?
Yeah, I remember.
Yeah, okay. Well, Rupert was a huge star from Inspector Maygrey, but he was also what we call in the profession typecast. So if anyone saw him on camera, people would tend to say, "Oh my God, that's Inspector Maygrey, what's he doing in this drama?" You know. So he stopped getting work as an actor, which is pretty awful. And he would sometimes take us to the BBC club, where because he was a star, people would go, "Oh, hello, Rupert," you know. But all the producers and directors would not look at him, you know. "Oh, there's Rupert, oh God," you know, move off to one side. So it was awful. It was a sort of a bit of a blackout. Stupid, you know. Hey, he's an actor, you know. Give him a go, something. Anyway, I couldn't understand it, but I did later on, I think. However, at the time, he was thrilled to be able to do a whole series where you could hear his voice, and you might go, "Oh, that sounds a bit like Inspector Maygrey, I think," but you couldn't say for sure. And here he was as this puppet character, and that was wonderful for him. So he was very relaxed, he was very happy. And the little boy, I cannot remember who he was.
I want to say Len Davies, but that's not Len Davies is actually here. Len Jones, thank you.
Right. Obviously he's long since grown up, but he was terrific, he was very relaxed. And of course the rest of us had done Captain Scarlet and the Mistron, so we knew each other. There you are. And we also knew that we were probably going to play all the villains, which is much more interesting.
Just to digress a bit more about Rupert Davies, the weird thing now, the way that things last in people's memories, most people don't remember Inspector Maygrey now. It's in black and white. The BBC have probably thrown them all away. Nobody's seen it for 40 years.
It's a great pity.
Yeah. But Rupert Davies is still very well known for what work he did get after that, because he worked a lot in things like horror films, which have a huge shelf life.
I didn't know he'd done the horror film circuit.
Yeah, so he is actually quite well known for what work he did get. And the thing he was massively famous for, Inspector Who?
Yes. Well, Peter Cushing. Peter Cushing went forever in Bray Studios doing Hammer Horror with, what's his name, Lee.
Yeah. Christopher Lee.
Yeah, Christopher Lee. Yes, I went to see one of those at a Bristol matinee, in the middle of which I suddenly thought, "Oh my God, I should be at the theatre." The people probably thought there was something horrible.
That's the most frightened anyone's ever been at a horror film.
Yes.
The Secret Service, please tell us what it was like working with Stanley Unwin. That must have been something else.
Stanley was wonderful. Stanley had started life as an engineer for the BBC. I don't know if anyone knows that. And I think someone told me to the very end, he used to have a little studio in his house where he would do things with amateur people in the district that he lived in. He was extraordinary. He'd come up with this language. He had done a naughty recording of a lady who Lord Reith, who ran the BBC at that time, loved. She was the lady who used to do the children's broadcasts. And she always referred to pins, I think, as pricks. "Now, children, take your pricks in your right hand." So it was very funny. And Stanley had recorded this and put it onto a disc, as you did in those days, and it went around the BBC engineers, and they all had hysterics. You know? Anyway, I think he got a rap over the knuckles for that. But in the midst of, if anyone pinned him down and said, what did you do with that record, you know, he would go into this, and they would be bewildered, you see. Anyway, a couple of people said to him, this is very funny stuff, why don't you, because it sort of related to English, why don't you go and do that on the vaudeville circuit, or as it was then, music hall circuit. So he did, and he became hugely successful as Professor something or other, I can't remember what, who would come out and do this lecture in this funny language. Jerry must have obviously seen it somewhere and decided this was the perfect person he wanted as the parson in the series, you know. So if ever he was pinned down by the villain, he went into his language, you know.
Do you know if the unreleased sections were scripted, or whether it was just, right, here's your bit, Stan, do your thing?
I think Jerry sort of, or the writer concerned, would say, this is generally what we think you should be telling these villains, Stanley. Could you Stanleyize it? Yeah. Or whatever. Unwinize it? Any of that.
And you got to do, I mean, this is the really remarkable thing as somebody with an Australian-Canadian background. Not only did you do an English accent as Matthew Harding, you did 2 English accents. You did the received pronunciation, Sean Connery Spy.
Yeah,
and
right, that's right. I sat on a Bristolian, didn't I? I've seen a lot of those people there. Would you like to tell the real, my Jack?
Were the different voices kind of auditioned, you know?
I suppose, I don't know. You see, when I went back to Oz, I got into Neighbours. I was Uncle Tom in Neighbours with Kylie and Jason and a lot of people in the early days. I only did about 6 months on it, but I had to consciously work at loosening up the accent a bit because I was supposed to be a plumber. Kylie's uncle, but a plumber. And so that was helpful. And also I do a fair amount of commercials, voiceovers on commercials. So, you sir, sitting there, you know, that kind of stuff. To do with Carlton Draft, which is a beer in Australia. So, yeah, that sort of thing.
Yeah. It's right to say nobody drinks 4X in Australia. They just send that muck over to us.
Well, well, I mean, that's Queensland muck. Yes, no, I actually drink Redback, which is a wheat beer. I can't tell the sponsors.
Now, you returned to Secretary 21 the same year as the Secret Service for a small role, as you mentioned, in the first episode of UFO.
Yes.
Do you think that was some kind of a long service award for all the work that you've done?
Jerry was just wonderful that way. Jerry was very, he stuck by all the people that he used. I'm searching for the word, loyal. He was wonderfully loyal to you as an actor if you worked well within his team, and it was like he considered you one of the technicians, one of the crew, you know. Yeah. So I said to him, look, because he said to me, I'm going to be doing this new series, UFO, and it's live action. And I said, I would love to be in it, but I'm about to go back to Canada. You know, my Canadian wife, her mother was unhappy that she was Scottish-Canadian. I mean, can you get a better mix than that? And she was in great horror that we might have gone back to Australia. So we went back to Canada, and just before I left, he said, look, I would love you to be in the pilot episode. Just a small part. Would you do it? And I said, of course, yes, of course. So that's how it happened.
Do you have any memories of being on set?
Well, George Sewell played the lead, as you know. It's very funny. My daughter is a writer in Canada. Her name is Gemma Files, and she writes fantasy horror. Don't ask. Anyway, she, a friend of hers said, "Oh my God, I'm watching the first episode of UFO, and your father is in it." And she said, "Oh wow," and she came over to watch, and she couldn't see me. Where the hell is this guy? And finally, I popped on screen. In case anybody's wondering, I'm Phil Wade. That was it, I think. I don't think I said it anymore. No, I remember.
Oh dear. So that's you've answered my next question. That's why you left England.
Yes. Yeah. I felt I had been in the West End, which is what I wanted to do. I was in a musical called Your Own Thing, which was on at the Comedy Theatre, and I worked with a lot of Canadians there, and they jiggled my Canadian button enough for me to say, "Hey, I think I'd really like to go back there again," you know. So, and my wife was very happy to go back because she was Canadian.
Yeah. And you got into writing and directing.
Yes, writing and directing in Canada. I started in radio writing for a wonderful man called Robert Weaver, and then I did a series with Frankie Howard. To my utter astonishment, playing a Canadian. It was called The Frankie Howard Show, of course.
All his shows are called The Frankie Howard Show.
Well, this was definitely The Frankie Howard Show, you know. And he used to say, and it was written by a couple of real dimwits. Sorry, but it was. And my character was called Harden I Oughta Be. Harden I Oughta Be. Okay. And his mother ran the boarding house that Frankie Howard had a room in, you know. And I was the idiot son of the house. And when I say idiot, I mean idiot. You know, all that kind of stuff. And Frankie was very funny, and very kind to me, and very helpful. Once I made my position clear, I was not of... That was fine. Yeah, and it was a fantastic series to do. We only did 13 episodes. But he used to say to us sometimes, "Is this funny?" And we'd say, "No." I didn't think so. I shall have to do something here. I shall have to do something.
Well, time's running a bit short, so we'll skip a few years and go back to you going back to Australia in the late 70s, would that be right?
Yes, I went back in '76 from Canada.
Now, things really were happening in the Australian film industry.
They were, yes.
In that sort of that boom.
Yeah, I was lucky to get into a couple of films and work with Bruce Beresford for a start in a film called The Money Movers, in which I played this Weasley accountant type, funny glasses and all that kind of stuff. And I did a couple of other films. I started in television land doing TV series, and I started doing voiceovers, which I hadn't really considered up until that time. It being one of those days, in the old days, you didn't really do voiceovers, you know, unless you were desperate or something. However, there were one or two people who were right onto it. A guy called John Carson was wonderful. Miriam Margolis, as you probably, a lot of you know her, had been doing it for years and had made a fortune. I was desperate. I was in Canada. I had a small family. I started writing because of desperation. And I also started doing commercials, which I had never done, out of desperation. And that was terrific. That, especially with the voice thing, led to many more.
I could stay here all afternoon, happily. But we do have to wrap up now, unfortunately.
Okay.
So, I hope you agree. It's been absolutely fascinating talking to Gary. Please give a round of applause.